It was supposed to be just another day at the Airshow, the roar of the jets, the cheers from the crowd, the scent of popcorn and sunburned joy hanging in the air. But then it happened, an F-18 fighter jet, sleek, unshakable, and moving at impossible speed, suddenly veered off course mid-flight. Its wings dipped, its path curved, and every eye on the ground locked onto something else entirely. An old man sitting quietly in the front row, wearing a faded cap with trembling hands folded over a cane. No one knew his name, not yet. But by the end of that day, they'd be chanting it. What could possibly cause a fighter jet to change course for a stranger in the crowd? What history was hidden in that weathered face? And what secret was powerful enough to make even the U.S. Navy pause mid-sky stick around? Because what happens next will leave you stunned, and before we dive in, tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. We've got an incredible global community here, and your voice matters just as much as this story. Now let's begin. They came for the roar of the engines, for the rush of thunder that echoed through their chest cavities. They came for spectacle, for smoke trails in the sky, and pilots who seemed to flirt with gravity like it was an old friend. The Airshow was a tradition in this small American town, a way to remember the past and inspire the young. Flags waved, sunscreen melted on foreheads, and vendors shouted over the noise of jet engines as children pointed to the heavens wide-eyed, but no one, not a single soul that day, came expecting what happened next. The F-18 was performing its final maneuver, a high-G vertical climb that turned into a spiral descent, the kind of move that makes the crowd gasp and the pilots grin under pressure. It was almost over. The crowd had started to shift, ready to stretch, grab one last lemonade, maybe beat the traffic. And then the jet tilted. Not as part of the routine, not as some choreographed flourish. It banked left, hard and sudden, breaking formation, cutting through the sky like it had seen. A ghost, slicing through protocol, slicing through breath. Even the announcer went quiet, unsure if what he was seeing was planned or a malfunction. Then came the collective exhale of thousands watching, that strange moment where humans synchronize in fear. Parents pulled their kids close, eyes squinted upward, phones were raised, but hands trembled just enough to blur every shot. And then the murmurs began. Why did it turn? What happened? Who's in control? No one had answers, until someone noticed the man front row, Section B. He hadn't moved since the show began, not even flinched, when the Blue Angels tore overhead like thunder gods. He sat like stone, legs close together, cane in hand, and a cap faded from sun and time perched gently on his head. It said USMC, the letters worn and slightly torn. But it wasn't just the hat. It was the eyes that didn't follow the jet's eyes, that stared into a place far beyond the sky. That's when a child tugged on her father's sleeve and pointed Daddy. The plane turned toward him. She whispered. The father blinked, unsure if he should dismiss her words or feel the chill crawling up his spine, and just then, the F-18 passed low again. Not dangerously low, but deliberately so. Like a bird acknowledging someone who once taught it how to fly. Cameras turned from the sky to the old man. People stopped watching the show and started watching him. A woman nearby whispered to her husband, "Do you think they know him?" The husband, a former Navy man himself, narrowed his eyes and muttered, "They know something." No announcements came, no alarms blared. But everything changed in that moment. What was just a Saturday spectacle became something else entirely. The air around the old man felt different, like the gravity near him had shifted. The wind, too, seemed to flow around him with respect, not force. Reporter in the crowd noticed the shift and lifted her camera, zoomed in on the man's weathered face and froze when she caught the trace of a tear, not from fear, but memory. Then the real show began. Not from the stage, not from the sky, but from the story that slowly unraveled from that still figure in the front row. Because this wasn't just any man. This was someone who once held the fate of missions in his silence, who once whispered into headsets that crackled with war, who once walked away from a cockpit without looking back, knowing he had already left parts of himself in the clouds, and now the clouds were coming back to greet him. His name was Samuel Briggs, but no one in the crowd knew that yet. Not the mothers passing popcorn to their kids, not the veterans in the back row adjusting their sunglasses, not the teenagers glued to their phones until that very moment Samuel Briggs, age 91, retired. Colonel, former flight commander, once hailed as the man who flew without fear, was now just an old figure in the front row, tucked beneath a program booklet and silence. No announcements had introduced him, no banners welcomed him. He didn't come to be honored, he came to remember, and as the jet circled above, veering from routine, the hush spread like a slow ripple. Across a still lake, it started with one man taking off his cap, then another, and soon, in silent reverence, an entire section followed. Not out of protocol, but instinct. The kind of instinct that rises when something sacred brushes past ordinary. Life, Samuel's gaze never left the sky inside. Memories were igniting like flares, not gentle or nostalgic, but sharp, vivid, unfiltered, the way only a soldier remembers, not by years or dates, but by noise, by fear, by smell, by names carved into memory like initials into oak. He had flown missions no one dared talk about, Vietnam skies that swallowed, entire squadrons, secret deployments that existed only in blacked-out files, nights where engines sputtered over jungles and decisions were made in milliseconds, where silence wasn't bravery but survival. He had once flown an F-4 Phantom through, a thunderstorm so fierce it cracked a wing. But he brought it home, limping, battered, and unbroken, and he never spoke of it again. The military had honored him, once, quietly, away from cameras, a plaque, a medal, a handshake. But what mattered to Samuel weren't the ceremonies. It was the brothers he'd lost in the clouds, and that's why he came to the show every year, same seat, same silence, because the sky was the only place they still flew together. As the jet banked again, slower this time, more deliberate. Samuel's eyes glistened, and the pilot, thousands of feet above, made a subtle adjustment to the wings, a dip, almost like a nod. He wasn't supposed to do that. The Navy didn't allow for mid-air improvisation, not during a live air show, but this wasn't disobedience. This was loyalty, because that pilot had read the seating chart that morning, and next to Section B, Row 1, Seat 3, it simply reads Briggs, VP, and that's when the whispers in the control tower began. Someone asked, "Why is he adjusting course?" Someone else replied, "Because Colonel Briggs is down there." The name moved like wind through the ranks, Colonel Briggs, a name that hadn't been spoken in decades, suddenly floating on lips like it belonged to a legend. And perhaps it did, back on the ground. A young man in uniform moved swiftly toward the front row. He didn't stop to explain, didn't wave or gesture. He simply stood behind Samuel, straight-backed, hands clasped behind him like a junior officer reporting for duty. Samuel didn't turn, but he knew he felt it in the air, because for the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. The crowd watched in awe, unsure what they were witnessing, but certain it was no longer just an air show. A child near the front whispered, "Is he famous?" An older woman beside her replied, "He's something more than that, darling." As if on cue, the jet passed again, this time slow enough to see the shimmer of the cockpit glass, and inside, the pilot raised his fingers to his temple. A salute mid-flight, unheard of, unsanctioned, undeniable. And Samuel, without moving his head, raised one trembling hand to return it. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it was the loudest moment of the day, because in that quiet salute, two generations of warriors acknowledged each other, not with words, not with medals, but with understanding, thousands of feet above. Inside the cockpit of that roaring beast of a machine, Lieutenant Marcus Hale kept his eyes locked on the horizon, but his thoughts were anchored to the ground. To that one man in the front row who once trained the legends, Hale grew up reading. About? The salute wasn't planned. He knew it was risky, but some things demand acknowledgement, no matter the rule book. He had only heard whispers about Colonel Samuel Briggs, a ghost in the hallways of naval academies, a name that came up during late-night simulator drills, mentioned with reverence by instructors who had once flown under his command, a man whose tactics were still studied. Though most cadets didn't even realize they were his, Briggs had retired before Hale was born. But the legacy, it lingered, and Hale, like every pilot who knew the name, had read one particular declassified account buried deep in the digital archives, an engagement during Operation Silver Eclipse, an unauthorized maneuver in enemy airspace that had saved an entire convoy but nearly got Briggs court-martialed. He had broken orders, risked everything, and refused to accept a medal for it. He didn't. Want glory? He wanted his men alive. That day, the skies had obeyed him, and history had nearly erased him. But not every pilot forgets Hale had seen the name on the guest list and made a silent vow to himself before takeoff. If he spotted the colonel, even once, even for a second, he'd find a way to honor him. And now, he had down below, Samuel blinked slowly, the memory of his final mission flashing like lightning behind tired eyes, not in fragments, but in full, the way trauma and honor often intertwine. He hadn't meant to come this year. His knees ached more. His breath was shorter, and his doctor warned him about the strain of large crowds and loud noise. But something pulled him there. Something that felt like unfinished business. Maybe it was a whisper in a dream. Maybe it was the face of a friend he hadn't thought about in years, but when he woke that morning, he knew he had to go. And now, watching that jet defy its pattern, his heart confirmed it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was fate circling back. A crowd was completely still, as if the whole event had transformed into a ceremony. Every sound felt muffled, every heartbeat synced with the roar overhead. A reporter whispered to her cameraman, "We're not covering an air show anymore. We're witnessing history." But no one knew what kind of history yet. Just then, a soft crackle came through the loudspeakers. The announcer paused, clearly shaken, clearly unsure, but then cleared his throat and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge someone very special among us today. Colonel Samuel Briggs, retired United States Marine Corps, seated in the front row, sir. We thank you for your service." The applause didn't come instantly. It wasn't that kind of moment. People didn't clap out of habit. They stood, one by one, like waves rising from the ocean. People rose to their feet, hats came off, hands found. Hearts and children looked around in quiet confusion, unsure why everyone was suddenly crying. A young woman whispered to her son, "That man flew through hell for us." And the boy, wide-eyed, asked, "Did he win?" She smiled and said, "He survived, baby, and that's more than enough." Samuel didn't stand. He couldn't. But his chin lifted slightly, and the wind caught the corner of his program, flipping it to the page, with the event schedule, which now seemed laughably unimportant, because no one cared about formation times anymore. They cared about the man who made the sky pause and the pilot above. Still circling hadn't broken formation again, but he didn't have to. He had said what needed saying without words, without noise, just respect, pure and untamed. The applause faded slowly, not into silence, but into something heavier, something sacred, the kind of quiet that blankets a moment so fully it becomes untouchable, unrepeatable, the kind of quiet that comes after a truth has been revealed, not spoken, just known. Colonel Briggs closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from memory. He could still feel the metal of the throttle under his palm, still hear the old comms crackling like dry leaves in a storm, voices calling out targets, warnings, prayers. He had been the voice others waited on, the man whose orders shaped survival, and with every decision, a piece of him stayed behind, not in medals, not in documents, but in the eyes of the pilots who came home because of him, and in the names of the ones who didn't. He opened his eyes and looked at the jet overhead. One more time. Not in awe, not in fear, but like a teacher watching a student take the final exam and pass. The jet finally veered off, returning to its original route, a graceful arch like a curtain falling on a play no one expected but everyone would remember. A young woman approached him, gently, her press badge swung around her neck, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "Colonel Briggs, sir. I'm with the local station. Would it be all right if I ask you a few questions?" Samuel turned slightly, his gaze soft but firm, and said, "Only if you're not here for a soundbite." She nodded slowly. Sitting on the edge of the bench beside him, her camera operator staying respectfully back, she asked, "How did it feel, sir, to see that pilot break formation for you?" Samuel chuckled, low and almost private, then said, "Felt like he remembered, something most people forget." "What's that, sir?" He looked at her. "Freedom doesn't come from silence. It comes from those willing to break formation when it counts." She paused, unsure how to respond, because what could she possibly say that would match the weight of that sentence? Behind them, the crowd was beginning to move again, slowly, like waking from a shared dream. But no one was quite the same. Vendors had stopped shouting. Children stopped whining. Even the jets now sounded more like whispers than thunder. Samuel tapped his cane twice on the concrete, a rhythm familiar only to him, and began to rise slowly. The young officer behind him moved forward instantly, offering his arm. Samuel didn't refuse, but he didn't lean either. They walked side by side, not quickly, not toward anything in particular, just forward. And as they moved, people parted like the Red Sea, not because anyone told them to, but because something ancient in them recognized that this man didn't just walk through the crowd. He carried it. Every freedom, every moment of peace, every second someone spent without fear. He carried all of it. And he was still carrying it. Now, the walk from the front row to the gate was less than 60 feet, but to those watching, it felt like a parade of ghosts and glory. The kind of walk that holds more weight than fanfare, more history than headlines. Samuel Briggs didn't wave, didn't smile, but every step he took carried names, faces, stories. Young officer beside him stayed silent, respectful, not just of the rank, but of the man, because he too had heard the stories, passed down like bedtime myths among junior recruits' stories of a mission that never made the newspapers, a maneuver that rewrote the outcome of a classified war zone, and a decision that saved hundreds while disobeying one order. It wasn't mutiny, it was conscience, and it changed everything. At the gate, a man in a plain suit was waiting, not military, not press older, sharp eyes behind gentle wrinkles. He stepped forward and said, "Colonel Briggs." Samuel stopped. His gaze narrowed, recognition flickered. In his tired eyes, like a candle catching wind, "Langston," he said, voice cracking not from age but from the weight of the name. Langston nodded once, a subtle smile rising. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Samuel whispered. "Neither did I, sir. But some things can't stay buried forever. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands. They just stood there, two men who had once shared the same cockpit, the same mission, the same night they thought would be their last. Langston was the radar officer from Operation Silver Eclipse, the man who had stayed conscious just long enough to reroute comms when they were ambushed in blackout airspace, the man who had lost two fingers in that mission and never once mentioned it. After Samuel hadn't seen him in 43 years, they sat on a bench just past the gates, out of the way of cameras and questions, and for a moment, neither spoke, until Langston finally broke. "The silence, I was the one who called the pilot," he said quietly. Samuel blinked, I figured. If anyone deserved a nod from the sky, it was you. Samuel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Langston continued, "Kid's good, Hale, Navy's finest. He asked me who you were. When he saw your name on the roster, and you told him the truth, I told him the part that still lives in me." Samuel looked at the sky. Now, empty of jets. Just quiet blue, soft and wide. I didn't think any of it mattered anymore. Langston shook his head slowly. That's the curse of men like us. We think the battle ends when the shooting stops. But the echoes, Sam, they live. Longer than we do. They sat there in silence again. Not awkward, not heavy. Just true. Two warriors, two relics, two pieces of history breathing in the same hour. People walked past without noticing, too distracted by cotton candy and souvenir stands, unaware that just steps away, the final chapter of an untold war story was. Being closed in whispers, Langston reached into his coat and pulled out something small, square, and wrapped in cloth. "Been holding on to this," he said, placing it in Samuel's palm. Samuel unwrapped it slowly. It was a mission. Patch. Faded. Frayed. Burned at the edges, the original from their final flight, Operation Silver Eclipse. He had thought it lost in the wreckage. Samuel stared at it for a long time, then placed it gently over his heart. No words. No thanks, just truth. The cloth-wrapped patch sat pressed against Samuel's chest like a heartbeat from the past. Like a medal no one ever gave him but meant more than all the others combined. He held it there for a moment longer before folding it back up carefully. Like something sacred, like a flag before it's handed to a widow. Langston looked out across the airfield, the grass swaying under the gentle wind that always seemed to follow old warriors around. He said, "The world moved on, Sam. They gave us silence in return. For service, and sometimes I wonder if it was a fair trade." Samuel didn't answer immediately. He simply watched a boy running across the field, chasing his shadow, free, fast, untouched by memory. Then he said, "It was never about the trade, Langston. It was about whether they get to keep running without ever needing to look over their shoulder." Langston nodded. That was always Samuel's way, simple words, heavy truth. The crowd inside had returned to the show. Jets were prepping for another pass. Announcers resumed their banter. The noise rose again, but the magic from earlier didn't return. Something had shifted. The airshow was back on schedule, but the day had changed back inside. The young reporter who had spoken to Samuel earlier stood in front of the camera, her hands shaking slightly. She looked into the lens and said, "What we witnessed today wasn't just an air show, it was a moment of reverence, a reminder that some men walk among us with stories too powerful to be measured in medals or headlines. Colonel Samuel Briggs didn't ask for attention, but today, attention found him." The video would go viral by nightfall clips of the jet-breaking formation, photos of the old man in the front row, whispers about a secret mission no one had ever heard of. Hashtags would trend. Historians would scramble young pilots, would post tributes and across the country and eventually beyond. People would look up the name. Samuel Briggs, not a senator, not a billionaire, not a celebrity, just a man who had once said yes to the kind of duty that asked for everything and returned very little. And people would ask, why hadn't we heard of him before? And the answer would come because real heroes don't tell their stories. They carry them aboard a hospital ship 3 oceans away. A nurse paused her rounds when she saw the footage. She recognized the face instantly. Years ago, before she had even earned her stripes, Colonel Briggs had spoken at her academy. Not to give a lecture, not to impress, but to listen. He had sat with cadets at the cafeteria, eating the same powdered eggs and answering every question like time didn't matter. She remembered how he said, "Never forget the people behind the ranks, the ones who carry the weight but never wear the medals." And now, seeing his face again, she sat down on the edge of a cot and whispered, "Sir, they finally saw you." In a quiet corner of the Pentagon, a young analyst paused his report to watch the same clip. His superior glanced over and muttered, "That man once rewrote a mission plan mid-air while losing fuel and saved 3 squads. They buried the details in a red file marked discretion." The analyst blinked. He had read about ghosts like that, never expected to see one sitting at an air show and far above. In a cockpit cooled by altitude and adrenaline, Lieutenant Marcus Hale heard the radio buzz in his helmet. "Lieutenant, you've gone silent for a while. Everything all right?" He clicked his mic. "Yes, sir, just taking in the sky." But what he really meant was, "I just saluted history." The video didn't need an algorithm to go viral. It spread the way truth always does. Quietly at first, then all at once, someone posted it with a caption that read, "The jet didn't break formation." For drama, it did it for a ghost in the front row. And within hours, it had been shared across military forums, veteran groups, news stations, and even classrooms. People began to ask questions, not shallow ones, not clickbait, but real ones. Who was this man? Why hadn't anyone heard of him? And how did one pilot recognize something in him that a whole nation had forgotten? In a small house tucked into a quiet neighborhood, Samuel sat alone that evening, the TV off, the lights dimmed. He didn't need to watch the news to know what was happening. He could feel it in the way his phone vibrated every few minutes. Voicemails piling up, messages from names he hadn't seen in decades. "Colonel, it's Danny. From Echo Squadron, sir. I saw the clip. We always knew you were a legend. But now the world does too." Another voice. "Sir, I teach ROTC now. My students are asking about you. What should I tell them?" Samuel listened one by one, his fingers trembling just slightly as he deleted each message after hearing it. Not out of disrespect, but because he didn't need reminders of who he was. He remembered. Even if the world had forgotten. Langston called just after sunset. "You all right, Sam?" Samuel took a long breath, then said, "Feels strange being remembered." Langston chuckled. "You never needed to be remembered. You needed to be understood." That night, under a ceiling fan older than most of the country's memory, Samuel sat with an old box in his lap. Inside were things no one had seen in years, a flight badge burned at the edge, a letter never sent, folded so many times it had split in the middle of photo, faded and crinkled, of 4 men standing in front of a jet that never made it home. He stared at the photo for a long time, then whispered their names, one by one, like a ritual, not for them, but for himself. Because the memory of war isn't loud, it's quiet, it lives in. The pause between phone rings, in the silence after applause. In the space between sky and earth, where some promises still wait to be fulfilled, back in Washington. A meeting was called in a secure room with no windows and too many flags. Someone slid a laptop across the table and hit play. No one spoke until the video ended. Then a voice said, "We forgot him." Another said, "No, we buried him." A third voice asked, "So what do we do now?" Silence. Then a woman in uniform leaned forward and said, "We do what he never asked for but always earned. We honor him." And just like that, a decision was made. An invitation would be sent, not for publicity, not for ceremony, but for redemption. The letter arrived 3 days later, not in a digital inbox, not through some assistant or courier, but in a plain white envelope slipped quietly into the mailbox like it was meant to avoid attention, addressed in clean handwriting, the kind used when someone still believes in dignity. Samuel stood at the door, holding it in his hand for almost an hour before opening it. He didn't rush, he already knew what it was. Inside was a folded note on Department of Defense letterhead, and beneath it a second envelope sealed in wax. The note was short: Colonel Briggs. "On behalf of the Armed Forces, we formally invite you to attend the National Ceremony of Aerial Valor, where you will be recognized for your lifetime of service and bravery. The event will be broadcast nationally." No RSVP was required. The envelope beneath contained something else entirely, a mission log from Operation Silver, Eclipse Unredacted. It had his name, Langston's, the call signs, the decisions made in the air. That night, and at the bottom, in fresh ink, one sentence: "We got it wrong. Thank you for getting it right." Samuel sat back in his chair, the paper in his lap, the past and present colliding in a single quiet moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud. He was just still, like a tree weathered by 100 storms, not reaching for the sky, just standing tall enough to remember the thunder Langston called again that night. "I heard they're making it official, Sam. Medal and all." Samuel chuckled softly. "They're late." Langston paused, then replied, "Better late than never, sir." That Saturday, Samuel boarded a flight to D.C., his first time in the air in years. As the plane ascended, he looked out the window, and for a split second, he saw something below. Another jet far beneath, banking left, wings glinting in the sunlight. A nod, a memory, a ghost. Or maybe just the sky remembering him back. The ceremony was quiet by design. A hangar, transformed into a sacred space rose of active duty. Personnel stood at attention. Veterans filled the back rows. No cameras beyond the official feed. No press beyond a single military journalist. Samuel entered slowly, cane in hand, but no assistance needed. He wore his old dress blues, perfectly tailored, barely altered. The room stood when he did, but not out of protocol, out of respect. Not for the medals, not for the rank, but for the silence he had carried all these years, and for the roar he never asked for, but had finally earned. When he approached the podium, he didn't speak right away. He looked across the crowd, his eyes catching faces he'd never seen but somehow knew, and then he said, "I am not here to relive a war. I am here to remember those who never came home from it." Silence. No claps. Just breath held, he continued, "There are stories that never make it into books, but they live in the men and women who carry them. Today you honor me, but I ask you to find someone who's never stood behind a podium and thank them too. Because heroes aren't always the ones who fly jets. Sometimes they're the ones who watch them disappear into the clouds and wait forever." That was all. He stepped back. The medal was pinned, but he never looked down at it, because medals were made of metal, and his memories were made of names. The ceremony was supposed to be a quiet affair, a private military moment tucked behind official walls, but within hours of its close, someone uploaded the speech. Not a shaky phone clip, but the official military feed, crisp audio, tight framing on his face, and when Samuel Briggs said those final words about waiting for jets that never return, the internet stopped. Within 12 hours, the video had been seen by 6 million people by the end of the weekend. It had crossed 40 million. Not because of algorithms, not because of edits or filters, but because something in his voice cut through noise like a jet through fog. People didn't just watch it. They felt it. Veterans from different generations posted tributes, some in uniform, some in hospital beds, some without words, just tears and salutes. Even families who had never served wrote about it, saying they now understood their grandfathers in a way they never had before. News anchors cried on live television. Trying to read his quote aloud, educators paused their lectures to play the clip in classrooms, and somewhere in the middle of rural America, a 12-year-old boy watched the video in silence, then turned to his mother and said, "I want to be someone like him." A week later, Samuel received a package, no return address. Inside was a folded American flag, but not just any flag. This one came with a note. Handwritten in shaky cursive, "Colonel Briggs, my son served under you during Operation Silver Eclipse. He never came home, but he always said if anything ever happened to him, to thank the man who gave him a fighting chance. I've kept this flag since his funeral, but it belongs with you." Samuel held the flag like it was glass. No tears came, just breath slow and full of weight. He placed it on his mantle. Beside the medal, beside the patch, beside the silence, Langston called again. "You've gone viral, Sam." Samuel laughed, the first real laugh in years. "They should have seen me when I had hair and a faster stride." Langston replied, "They're seeing something better now." People began showing up at his house, not to intrude, but to stand on the sidewalk quietly, with hands over hearts. Some left notes. Some left folded drawings from children. One little girl left a toy jet with a note that said, "You're my hero now." Samuel didn't open the door, but he stood behind it. Listened Felton for the first time in a long time. He didn't feel alone in his memory. He felt held by it back at the Navy base where Lieutenant Marcus Hale was stationed. Commanders pulled him into an office, showed him the video, showed him the world's reaction. "You broke formation." "Yes, sir." Why Hale didn't blink, because that man taught every one of us how to fly, even if we never met him. The commander nodded slowly, and then said, "Then from now on, that maneuver you made, we're calling it the Briggs tilt." And just like that, a nod in the sky became doctrine. The Briggs tilt became more than a maneuver. It became a symbol, not just among the Navy, but across every branch, every country, every base, where someone had once waited for a letter that never came. Pilots started requesting it during tribute flights, not for flair but for honor. One smooth left bank. Time to sunlight, the wings tipping ever so slightly toward the earth. And in that quiet arc, a million unspoken names were carried. Air shows across the country began opening with it. Families would stand, children would salute, and somewhere deep in every crowd, someone would close their eyes and whisper, "Thank you," and Samuel. He stayed quiet. He didn't give interviews. He didn't sign deals. He didn't go on podcasts or accept speaking offers. He sat on his porch in that same quiet neighborhood, watched the sky, and smiled whenever he heard a jet scream overhead, because now they were screaming his story. One morning, a letter arrived. This one, official and gold-trimmed, White House seal inside, a personal note from the president. It didn't read like a press release. It read like something handwritten by someone who had watched the clip at 2 a.m. and couldn't sleep after Colonel Briggs. "I may hold the office of Commander-in-Chief, but it's men like you who define what that actually means. You didn't just serve, you preserved for all of us, and I thank you with a full and humbled heart." No ceremony was scheduled, no medal attached. Just those words, "and for Samuel." That was enough. Meanwhile, across town, at a small middle school, a history teacher printed his photo and pinned it above the chalkboard. She told the class, "This is Colonel Briggs. He didn't write history, he flew through it and made sure others lived to tell it." One student raised their hand. "Will we learn about him in the textbook?" The teacher paused, then shook her head. "No, not yet, but maybe someday. If people like you remember him loud enough," and that was the truth. Heroes don't always live in chapters or curriculum. They live in the space between silence and sacrifice, and sometimes in a single tilt of metal against the wind. One evening, just after dusk, Samuel sat alone on his porch as the crickets began to hum and the last streaks of orange faded behind the rooftops. He was holding the patch again, the one Langston had given back to him, thumb brushing the edge where the fabric had burned so many years ago. The sound came before the sight, a low, familiar rumble across the clouds, not sharp like fireworks, not jarring like thunder, just steady, strong, and smooth. He looked up. There it was, an F-18, flying solo. It wasn't part of an air show. It wasn't a scheduled flyover. It was just there, tilting left in perfect silence, holding the Briggs tilt, right over his neighborhood, right over his house. No camera crews, no fanfare, just a pilot who knew what time the sun would hit just right and who the wind still answered to. Samuel didn't move, didn't wave, didn't need to, because the jet said everything, and he knew it wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Pilots were honoring him across oceans now, across borders, across generations. There were training manuals being updated, flight schools adding a new lesson, memorial walls carving a new line, the tilt that saluted silence. A war museum reached out. Asking if they could display his original patch, he declined. Told them it wasn't ready to rest behind glass just yet. He still needed it. Close Langston visited that weekend. They sat in the same chairs, watched the same sky. Didn't say much, didn't need to. Sometimes the deepest conversations happen between men who've shared the kind of silence most people never hear. Langston finally broke it. You ever think we were supposed to make it through all that? Just for this moment? Samuel smiled softly. No, I think we were supposed to make it through all that, so others didn't have to. The wind picked up gentle, almost like it was carrying their words somewhere far off, somewhere higher. Inside on, a small wooden shelf rested three things: the patch, the medal, and the toy jet left by the little girl with the note, all lined up in perfect formation, not for display, but for memory, for meaning. That night, as Samuel went to bed, he paused at the window, looked up again. Just in case, and there in the stars, he imagined one more silhouette wings tipped flying low, not toward battle, but toward home. The morning after the solo flyover, Samuel woke up earlier than usual. The sun had just begun to stretch across the quiet street, and the breeze carried that crisp edge only found in the early hours of a meaningful day. He brewed coffee. The old. No machines. Just patience. Then he stepped out onto the porch and sat in the same chair where silence had so often joined him. But today, that silence felt less heavy, less lonely. A car pulled up slowly. Not flashy, not official, just a clean black sedan. Out stepped a young woman in uniform. Her name tag read, Carter. She approached the porch with hesitation, eyes scanning the lines on his face like she'd memorized them already. Colonel Briggs, she said. Samuel nodded. That's what they used to call me. She smiled, nervous. I'm Lieutenant Carter, sir. I'm the granddaughter of James Carter. He flew under your command in '68. Samuel didn't move, but his eyes lit like the sun had just broken through clouds. Jimmy Carter. He said, the best second seat I ever had used to hum church hymns in the middle of thunder runs to calm his nerves. The young woman beamed. He told me stories, sir. Told me if I ever made it through flight school, I should find you. Thank you. Samuel looked down at his hands. So many names, so many voices. All still echoing in the spaces between his fingers. She reached into her jacket and handed him something small, a folded page from an old notebook. Yellowed. Frayed at the edges. He wrote this the night before your last mission together. Said he never gave it to you, but it was meant for you. Samuel opened it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still there. Shaky handwriting. Every word careful. If we don't make it back, tell the sky I tried. Tell Briggs he's the reason I was brave. Samuel exhaled, deep and full. He folded the note and placed it inside his pocket, next to the patch, next to the letter, next to the weight he still carried. Thank you, he whispered. Not to her, but to the past, to the men who never came home. And the few who did, Lieutenant Carter saluted Samuel, didn't return it, not out of rudeness, but because sometimes a salute is too small for what the moment deserves. Instead, he simply said, make sure you fly with your heart. That's the only thing that'll stay with you when the rest falls away. She nodded, eyes wet but steady, then walked back to her car and drove off. Not quickly, like she wanted the moment to stretch. Samuel leaned back in his chair, looked up again. The sky was empty, but full, because when you've lived long enough, you stop needing to see the jet to know it's there. You feel it in your ribs, in the wind, in the silence after a whisper. And that morning, Samuel Briggs sat with a letter in his pocket, a tilt in the sky, and a name that would now live, not in textbooks, but in hearts, where it always belonged. Weeks passed, then months. The attention faded, just like Samuel hoped it would, but the impact stayed, not on headlines, not in trending feeds, but in moments. Like the quiet pause a pilot took before takeoff, whispering the name Briggs under their breath. Like a superstition or a thank you or the way recruits at training camp started tapping the side of their helmet before their first solo flight. 3 times left hand, in honor of the tilt. They never called it a ritual, but it became one. Every base in the country had one wall, a wall of remembrance, usually for those who didn't come home. But now, some of them began adding a photo still frame from the Airshow. A jet mid-tilt, a man in the front row, cane in hand, eyes to the sky, and under the photo, a plaque that simply read, "For the ones who carried silence like a medal." In one particular squadron, Lieutenant Marcus Hale returned from deployment, his boots still muddy, his voice worn. He gathered the younger pilots in a circle and said, "Let me tell you about the man who taught me to honor the sky with more than just skill." He told them about the tilt, the Airshow, the walk, the porch, the silence. And when he finished, no one spoke. Then one recruit stood and asked, "Sir, what do we do if we ever see him again?" Marcus smiled. "Stand, up straight, salute without waiting for his return, and then fly like you never want to forget him." Back in Samuel's town, the mayor called to ask if they could name the airfield after him. He declined. Then later that night, he changed his mind, called back and said, "You can name it after the tilt, not me. Name it after the motion, not the man." And so they did Briggs Field, home of the Tiltat. The dedication Samuel didn't attend, but he watched from his porch live stream playing on a borrowed laptop, eyes misty but steady. He didn't need applause. He didn't need speeches. He just needed to know that what he did, what they all did, would not be lost in the noise of time. And now it wouldn't be, because every time a jet took off from that runway, it passed under a metal arch that said, "Break formation when it counts." 1 year later, almost to the day, the town held its annual air show again. Same runway, same chairs, same popcorn and blue skies and children on shoulders. But something felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just deeper. At the center of the field, a small plaque had been placed in the grass, not on a pedestal, not behind glass, just there at eye level. It read, "In honor of the man who flew, so others could land. Colonel Samuel Briggs, USMC." He never asked to be remembered. But people paused to read it. Some saluted, some just stood quietly, eyes soft, hands on their children's shoulders, and when the jets took off, the announcer didn't mention names, didn't announce maneuvers. He just said, "This one's for the tilt," and then like a memory, like a ghost, like a promise. Captain F-18 broke from formation, tilted left, dipped low, and held it there. The crowd didn't cheer. They rose, stood as one, hands to hearts. No phones, no noise, just respect. Back at home, in the house at the edge of town, the porch was empty, a flag folded neatly on the chair inside, a photograph now hung on the wall. 4 men, young, smiling, flight suits, dusty, backed by a plane no longer in service. And in the corner, a 5th, hand reaching toward the lens, as if to say, "Hold on to this, remember this, carry this." Lieutenant Carter stood at the edge of the runway that day, in full uniform, flight helmet under her arm, watching the tilt. She didn't cry, she smiled because legends don't disappear. They echo in the hands of a child holding a toy jet, in the chalkboard sketch of a maneuver that shouldn't have worked, in the way the wind lifts just slightly when the sky remembers your name. Samuel Briggs didn't die with a bang or a speech or a broadcast. He passed quietly, like a plane slipping through a cloud. No resistance, no regret, just return to the sky, to the names, to the mission. And now, every time a jet banks left, every time a pilot touches, the side of their helmet 3 times before takeoff. Every time a kid asks who that old man in the photo was, he lives again, because you can bury a man, but you can't bury what he carried, and what he carried now flies with all of us.